You're very welcome to the final panel of the ECR Day Extravaganza, and I am really excited about this one because I think it's such a great opportunity to hear from three people who've been really successful in transitioning beyond the university, and it's not something that we really hear so much about for arts and humanities, arts, humanities and social science researchers. There's often quite a lot of provision around this for people on the STEM end of things, so it's brilliant to be able to chat to such exciting and interesting people. So we are being recorded. Susie is recording us. And please do use the Q&A box down below to ask questions of our speakers. If you put a question in the chat box, I can't promise that it will get picked up in the questions. What else? If you'd like to tweet or share on social media, please use the hashtag, and please make sure if you're using a picture of somebody's face or a slide that you tag and cite them. That's it from me. All I'm going to do now is introduce Susie, who has done such an excellent job of chairing the whole day. So Susie is a PhD candidate here in history at Queen's, and she previously studied at Trinity College Dublin and Oxford. Her PhD, funded by the Department for the Economy, comparatively examines the impact of gender on political imprisonment during the Second World War in Ireland. She is postgraduate representative on the executive committee of the Women's History Association of Ireland. So that is all for me, and I will pass over to you, Susie.
Thanks so much, Alison. Thanks everyone for joining us. Our first speaker for this Careers Beyond the University panel is Dr. Tara Mcavoy. So if I could ask our other speakers to turn off camera and give Tara the spotlight for this session for the recording, that's okay. And then Tara, if you want to share your slides, and then I'll introduce you.
Thank you so much. Hopefully that's okay.
Yes. So Tara is press officer for Pushkin Press. She's also a fellow at the Seamus Heaney Centre at Queen's University Belfast, and the editor of the Tangerine, Belfast-based magazine of new writing. Tara won the Vogue Talent Contest in 2018, and she was runner-up for the Observer Anthony Burgess Prize for Arts Journalism. Her work has been published in Vogue, the Observer, the Guardian, and the Irish Times, and she completed her PhD in 2020 at Queen's. Thanks, Tara.
Thanks a million, Susie. I'll just set a timer here, and before I start, I just quickly want to say a word of thanks both to Susie and to Alison for organising this really exceptional few days, this ECR extravaganza. I think it's a really incredible programme and something that I'm sure I really would have benefited from during my PhD. So I hope it's been of help to the people watching at home, and hopefully this panel is of some help as well. I just wanted to start by saying a few quick words about my PhD study, and then I thought I'd just talk pretty informally about my career trajectory to date, just in case it's a useful sort of vision of how things might play out. I just thought I'd give some background on extracurricular activities I was involved in during my PhD and how those kind of fed into my current job. So just to start with the actual PhD project itself, I completed my PhD, as Susie mentioned, at Queen's in 2020. And the PhD was on forms of dissent in the work of two Irish poets, James Symonds and Padraig Fake, Poetry, Politics and Publishing in Northern Ireland between 1960 and 1980. And as some of you who are doing PhDs might be familiar with, this kind of changed a lot during the course of my study. So it began as something totally different and then evolved, I suppose, really in tandem with my extracurricular work. So publishing in particular, I came to be really interested in a way that transcended, academic study and branched out into other areas of my life. So I suppose, there was a symbiotic relationship really between the academic study and then what I was doing outside of that. In the end, the PhD ended up taking me a little bit longer than I had anticipated. It took 5 years instead of 3. I was lucky enough to receive a studentship to be able to do the PhD, and that ran for 3 years. I took a break to do some work experience, which I'll discuss in a little minute. And then I also ended up taking a write-up year and was working alongside that, which I suppose also enabled me to be able to do some stuff outside of the academic research. So there was a lot of spinning plates, I suppose, while I was doing my PhD, but yeah, it just really allowed me the opportunity to think over a longer period of time about what it was that I really wanted to pursue afterwards. Just for a little bit of context on pre-PhD, I also studied for a bachelor's and master's degree at Queen's. And when I was thinking about this talk and thinking about, my road into publishing and my current role with Pushkin Press, I was thinking about, where that interest arose. And I suppose that I was always keen to pursue sort of extracurricular activities, much to probably the dismay of lecturers and supervisors throughout my university career, but was always interested in, freelance writing, creative writing, journalistic writing, aside from academic study. Became involved with the university newspaper as an undergraduate, edited it then in my final year. So yeah, just to say that I suppose all those extracurricular activities that I tended towards without really knowing, if it would be helpful in the long run or even really having any sort of career focus in mind, all sort of fed into what I'm doing now in a way that's since become visible, but that I wasn't necessarily planning ahead for it at the time. So I mentioned that I'd done a little bit of freelance writing, and I really devoted more attention to this during the PhD. So aside from academic writing, I entered the Vogue Talent Contest in 2019 and wrote about the repeal referendum in the South. And then after that, I was able to write a little bit more for Vogue on subjects more closely related to my academic study. I wrote a few book reviews for The Guardian and also wrote for The Wire and a few other places. And this was kind of a really broad sweep of my interests, both related to Irish literature and a little bit broader as well. And I think, if you're at all interested in publishing and journalism, it's a really good chance, a PhD, while you don't have sort of a 9-to-5 necessarily, to explore your interests and to think about, how you can make your writing accessible for maybe a broader audience, how you can translate your academic interests for more general publications. And I think that, speaking personally, writing for these kind of broader publications really helped me when it came to academic writing as well, just in terms of how to translate concepts for an audience. So I think if you have any relationships with editors, if you would like to build them up, the PhD is just a great time to reach out and find out what it is that interests you, and work with as many people as possible to kind of shape your writing if you can. Alongside doing some freelance writing in terms of the more academic side of things, I also had the opportunity to have a week-long seminar at Leuven University and to attend Emory University as a short-term visiting fellow. So in the case of Leuven, this was for an Irish study seminar. In the case of Emory, this was for a fellowship to look at their Irish studies material in the library. So these are two quite specific examples, but I think that there are opportunities like this regardless of which department it is you're in, what specifically you're studying. So I would just say, where possible, it's great to keep an eye out for these as they arise. It'll help, your research, absolutely. But I think for me, these kind of opportunities were just really useful to get a sense of the field and to get a sense of even things as simple as putting in funding applications, making bids. Of course, for everyone that comes through, there will probably be, at least 10 that have been rejected. But I think just to kind of get into the habit of that was something that was really useful for me. In addition to traveling to these places and going to conferences and institutions elsewhere, something that I found really useful during writing the thesis was the opportunity to run conferences. So I co-organized this conference, finished it under construction, Irish Poetry since 1998, with a few other PhD students at Queen's. And this was a really sort of broad conference. We invited loads of people, loads of academics in the field. And I think, again, this just was a chance to develop some skills to be in touch with the sort of academic network around the field, and just to gain sort of, practical experience. So I suppose for this, we had to, develop everything from a website to putting together attendance lists, figuring out how many sandwiches we needed and all that kind of thing. So it was just a more sort of practical dimension to the PhD study than necessarily the academic writing had provided. And I think that there's funding available for these kinds of things. We did this through the Postgraduate Centre at Queen's, who were very supportive, as were the Seamus Heaney Centre and the School of English. So I think that if you are able at all to draw on these resources, it's great to be proactive about that kind of thing, because it will set you in good stead for the future, I suppose. If you're able to demonstrate really that you've taken the initiative and even, seen something through to completion, really. Aside from that, I suppose the biggest extracurricular that I was involved with during my PhD study was co-founding and then editing this magazine, the Tangerine Magazine. So this is a Belfast-based literary journal. We publish poetry, prose, fiction and non-fiction, photography and illustration. And this was set up with a few other PhD students at Queen's. So one thing that I was thinking about here, I suppose, is that, obviously, if you're on a PhD program, it's incredible in terms of the access to knowledge that you have. You might be really fulfilled by your research. But I think for me, what was also really sort of inspirational about that process was the people I was surrounded by. So you learn so much from your mentors and your supervisors, but I think it's great if you can connect with, your peers as well. And for me, that was one of the real benefits of the experience. So we came together to produce this, which is still being published. We're up to 11 issues now. And I think this was really my first toe in the door of publishing, I suppose. So just as a bit of background to the magazine and how it came about, we set up a Kickstarter to raise money for the magazine, and asked our friends if they could, donate things that we could sort of raffle away to inspire backers to help out the magazine. And we met our funding goal and could set it up. We then had to sort of promote it a little. So we wrote this piece for the Irish Times, which was one of the first pieces of publicity, I suppose, that ran for the magazine around the time of the Kickstarter campaign. And this was my first experience of trying to generate any sort of publicity, promotion. Then we also had, focus on social media for the magazine and all that kind of thing. So at the time, that just seemed like an necessity to get the magazine off the ground. But I suppose all that experience has fed into my current role as a press officer. Any sort of publicity background has been really helpful in, firstly getting that job and then seeing it through. The magazine also really taught me a lot in terms of distribution. So here we have some of the shops that stock the magazine. And, I feel like it provided a really comprehensive education, from liaising with printers, liaising with writers, sorting out contracts and payments, right on through to distribution and to running events. So this is a photograph from one of our launches in the Sunflower Bar in Belfast. Throughout the time that we were all studying for PhDs, we also ran events in tandem with a lot of literary and book festivals. So again, this was just a great chance to develop a full sweep of skills, and running events in particular was a really kind of core part of what we were trying to do with the magazine. Ultimately, that also enabled us to produce this book. So we did this in partnership with another small press in Belfast, the Lifeboat Press. And this was an anthology in praise of Bookfinders Cafe, which some of you, if you're Belfast-based, might remember. This was just opposite the university. And we solicited contributions from a range of lecturers, former students, people who'd passed through Queen's and Bookfinders over the years. And this was the first book project I worked on, which arose sort of directly out of working on the magazine. So I'll talk now about the sort of process that I had after all that about applying for jobs, but I just wanted to kind of summarize that section on the magazine by saying that, I'd always had sort of an interest in publishing, but as I'm sure many of you are aware if you're interested in that field. Often it feels like quite London-centric, which, I wouldn't dispute that necessarily. And also, I think there's a sense that people find it so hard to sort of get a foot in the door at all. So it seems like if you haven't had work experience, it's difficult to kind of move on beyond that. And absolutely, all these things are barriers. But I think that the magazine really taught me that, if you can possibly create opportunities where you are, rather than, waiting for opportunities that might not be sort of accessible to you, then it's really useful just to try and do what you can with what you have. So I think that for me, the whole experience of setting it up and trying to make it run taught me a lot, but also, stood me in good stead for applying for jobs down the line. When it came to applying for jobs then, I think in half of my head, I was thinking, oh, I might try and, stay in university, apply for postdocs, and I was applying for postdocs. I was also applying for jobs in publishing, arts administration, so taking a really kind of ecumenical approach to applying for jobs. Here I've just listed a few resources that I found helpful at that time. This is, after I've handed in my PhD, and then ultimately after the defense as well. As I mentioned, I was working part-time alongside finishing up. The bookseller jobs site, really helpful community arts partnership if you're based in Belfast, Arts Council, both in Ireland and in the UK, and then Guardian Jobs were resources that I consulted a lot during this period when I was thinking about possibly moving outside of the academy. And at this time, I should mention, I was also applying for postdocs, but they just seemed, harder, I suppose, in some ways, in that the applications were so much longer. So I was really firing out applications indiscriminately. And I think, important to say here too, that I had so many rejections from publishing jobs, arts admin jobs, all kind of jobs, before I came across the job that I'm now in. So this is with Pushkin Press, and this was listed on the Bookseller Jobs website. This is a press officer role, so in publicity. And I think one thing to say here is, when I thought about going into publishing, I was always really interested in an editorial role. And most of the jobs that I was applying for, maybe like 90% were editorial focused. Whereas this role, press officer, was something that I wasn't super familiar with. It was a bit of a leap of faith to apply. And I think that where possible, it's really useful to do things that maybe feel a bit tangential to your main interests, because they might, either allow you a way in, or you might come to love that role in and of itself. So I was lucky enough to get this role with Pushkin Press Officer after so many rejections from a sort of spate of editorial jobs. In terms of the interview process, and if anyone has any questions about this specifically, I'd be happy to talk more about it. It was a two-step process, including a practical exercise between rounds. So I had to put together sort of a campaign overview for one book, and this would detail, the publicity plan for the book, how I would attempt to get reviews, how I would attempt to get radio coverage. And then there was a final interview then, which focused on the leap from academia to trade publishing. So one thing I suppose to say here is that it's useful, certainly, if you have experience in the area you want to go into, but if you are coming from an academic background, it's also useful to think about how you're going to frame that move, right? So away from an area that maybe people perceive as, quite in-depth and quite focused. Things can often take a longer time in academia, whereas for something like publishing, the turnaround times are super quick. So I suppose it's just good to have in mind how you're going to frame that movement, and your suitability for a different kind of pace and a different kind of role. So in terms of my work with Pushkin, these are some of the highlights that I've worked on, I suppose. The Passenger, which became a really big book for the press, their first ever Sunday Times bestseller. A Night All Blood is Black, which went on to win the 2021 International Booker Prize. And then most recently, The Secret Lives of Church Ladies, which published in the UK yesterday. which is just a phenomenal short story collection that everyone at the press has really high hopes for. So I've got to work, I suppose, on a really broad variety of books, quite far away from the focus of my PhD. And I suppose that the role I'm in isn't something that I had anticipated ending up in, but it's been a really creatively rich period. And I really do feel like I've had the opportunity to apply, all the kind of resources that were at play during my PhD. So there's been the creative element of writing copy, there's been editing, there's been input on the design process. So it really has allowed me kind of a broad sweep of experience that I didn't necessarily anticipate when starting out. Just a quick word on how the role has evolved then. I began working remotely during the third lockdown, I think, over Zoom, but then moved to London to take up the role. So when it comes to publishing in particular, I think there is really still a London focus, although this has changed somewhat with the pandemic, or at least, a focus on the bigger cities. So one thing to bear in mind, definitely, and obviously there's somewhat of, a pressure in academia to always be available to move. And I suppose that publishing faces some of those issues as well, that it's not necessarily as set up for remote working as it might be, although this has changed a little bit. So I moved over to London. I've been there for the past year, and in fact just moved back yesterday. And I suppose the role has evolved somewhat in that now I'll be working on a freelance basis for Pushkin. So I think that if you do try and gain experience, it's always possible, hopefully, to transition to something that might work a little bit better for you. And then in terms of tips and questions, just to round up, if anyone has any questions, I'd be delighted to answer those at the end. In terms of tips, I suppose that's been a whistle-stop tour of maybe quite an idiosyncratic trajectory. So I don't know how much is useful to sort of apply, but maybe the main takeaway for me looking back has been that I think what served me well was a willingness to do things that were maybe slightly outside my experience, and to think in a more holistic, comprehensive way about how I could apply the experience that I had. So I don't think I ever set out to get into publicity and to being a press officer, but ultimately it's, been a great joy, and I've been really able, I think, to use the skills that I learned during my PhD and to continue working in an area that I love by, taking a little bit of a left field approach to how I might enter the area. So I suppose that's all from me for the minute. Thank you so much for listening. And yeah, please do let me know if you have any questions.
Thanks so much, Tara. That was fascinating and really interesting to get that insight into kind of a slightly different route for a journey. So thank you. And yeah, if anyone does have any questions, please put them into the Q&A, and I'll kind of collate them and we'll ask them all at the end. So our next speaker is Dr. James Bailey. If James wants to appear. Hi, James. Dr. James Bailey then. James is a writer and a researcher who is currently based in Manchester, and he is the author of Muriel Spark's early fiction, Literary Subversion and Experiments with Form, which was published last year with Edinburgh University Press, and also articles for publications including the European Journal of English Studies and Contemporary Women's Writing. And James is currently a senior staff member at Arts Council England. So thanks, James.
Thanks so much, and just like Tara, I wanted to start by saying a huge thank you to Alison for inviting me to speak today, and to Susie and everyone really who's been involved in making this event happen. As Tara said, I really wish something like this had taken place while I was completing my PhD, and certainly when I was deciding to make that move out of academia. And I know that many of the presentations that you've seen over the last couple of days have included some really helpful practical guidance around things like writing cover letters, grant applications, applying for postdocs. I don't know if my talk is quite as useful in a practical sense, but I do hope you find it reassuring to hear from someone who's made that transition to non-academic work. And this is really more of a personal reflection on some of the challenges and benefits that I've encountered along the way. So ahead of this event, Alison emailed me and everyone else who's taking part to ask for a short bio to use on the website. And I was just reflecting on this as I was writing this talk, because it's been a few years since I was asked to write one of these. But when I was in academia, this was something I do all the time. Like, I felt like I was forever defining who I was against my research project, my institution, my publication record, current funding, and so on and so on. And really, academia can tend to become your identity. Like, you become your research project, you become your funding history. And I guess your sense of self and your sense of self-worth can become a bit distorted in the process. And while extricating yourself from academic identity, if you like, while that can be quite liberating, it's also really unsettling. So once you've made that decision to move outside of academia, you do kind of find yourself wondering, like, who am I? How would I describe myself? What do I do? What do I have to offer? So this talk is kind of really about that and that process for me. And so I hope it's useful to someone. So for me, this sense of my identity being bound up with academic success, if you like, was really bolstered during my undergrad degree in English Lit. And it was towards the end of this degree that I secured funding for a master's. And there was really a view to going on straight into a PhD. And I knew exactly what I wanted to write about. It was Muriel Spark, just one of my favorite authors, really strange, funny, subversive fiction. I have seen on the attendee tab that we've got at least one Spark scholar with us today, so that's good to see. But as much as I wanted to do this, I had this strange, like, kind of nagging sense that things were moving a bit too quickly in an academic direction. And I really wanted to take a chance to see what else I could do before undertaking years of doctoral study. And that's because I was, aside from academia, I was really interested in work outside academia that was involved in removing barriers to public participation in art and culture. So instead of going straight into my PhD, I decided to take a break from that, and I went off instead and worked for a community foundation in Sheffield that focused on community fundraising and public engagement in the arts. And I did this for a couple of years all across South Yorkshire. And on reflection, I'm so glad I did. I'm so glad I followed that instinct, because this was non-academic experience. And when I was making that transition outside that came in really handy. So I would say to anyone who's taken kind of academic career breaks, don't feel guilty or have any kind of doubt about that, because there is so much you can pull from that and combine with your academic skills. But then I began my PhD, and I really had a lot going for me, a lot of privilege in that sense of when I began. You know, I had two really enthusiastic supervisors. I was given a full AHRC funding award. I had travel grants to do international archival work, and I was going to do teaching and lecturing work within the university. So, like, I was really, really fortunate. I had all these things going. At the same time, I was really aware of a pressure to finish within 3 years. We were reminded about it all the time from our first day registering. I was also very aware of the hyper-competitive job market, of the need to publish and publish widely, to network, to organize conferences, and so on. And you all know this, being here, like, the pressures on us are intense. And there was even one day quite early on where we were all brought into a room with computers and asked to either create a Twitter profile or to redesign our current one, to present it as, quote, a shop window for future employers to see who we are as researchers, the kind of funding we've attracted, and really make us as employable as possible. So going back to that earlier point about your identity being so tied up with academia, this was almost like we were being packaged and put out there. And that can be really hard, because it means that any kind of success or failure you feel all that much more sharply. It really kind of threatens that sense of self. And I think as PhD students, you're still kind of finding who you are as people, as researchers, you're finding your voice. So this all felt a bit too much too soon. And I think a lot of us struggled with that. These days, my Twitter tends to be comprised of pictures of cute animals wallpaper patterns I like, and various nice sandwiches that I've eaten. So you can see how well those plans the university had for me went in the end, didn't quite work out. But despite all this preparation for academic careers, there was absolutely no provision, no information about careers outside it, which just feels like such an oversight, even if you're desperately wanting to be in academia, there aren't enough roles. So it's bizarre to me that that was never factored in. It was almost taboo to talk about work outside of academia. So there was, it's probably unsurprising to hear, a real culture of overwork and performative overwork, and a real pressure to seize every opportunity going, be it a teaching contract, a publication commission, or whatever else. And people would talk very proudly about working weekends, evenings, through the night, not taking holidays unless this meant going off to a conference somewhere. And I think I certainly participated in that culture. I didn't want to miss out, and I was constantly reminded, especially by staff, of how lucky I was to have been funded and selected for various opportunities. But meanwhile, kind of behind the scenes, I was living with a disability, I had a caring responsibility, and I was also really struggling with my mental health in terms of the work and the pressure I was putting on myself. And the strain was just increasing and increasing. And because there wasn't a culture of openness, and because adequate protections weren't in place, such as sick pay, I was keeping this to myself and committing to more and more work until really I was too unwell to continue my studies. So what followed this kind of real high and this kind of very privileged position was a complete contrast, a period of acute ill health where I had to take an extended leave of absence to recover. And I'm very fortunate that I was able to get better and I had support and healthcare. And while there's absolutely no positive spin to put on this experience, recovering did allow me to see not only what I did and didn't want from work, but also what I needed in order to look after my health. And sadly for me, those things couldn't be found in academia, not in its current state anyway. I've already mentioned the culture of overwork, but other aspects like the precarity of short-term contracts, the likelihood of having to move around the country for work, and of course the ableism of academia really kind of made that decision for me. I wanted that elusive work-life balance I'd been hearing so much about. I wanted weekends off. I wanted to look after my health in lower periods. I wanted time for hobbies, and I wanted to build more of a life with my partner, my friends, and my family. And I just really couldn't see how I could have those things in academia. And it felt in many ways that the decision was being made for me. So I was getting better and I was ready to return to something, work, study, I wasn't sure. And I was faced with this difficult dilemma. If I couldn't see myself being happy and healthy in academia, do I continue that last stretch of work on my PhD? And I made the decision to stay and complete my PhD. And I did this for two reasons. First and foremost, otherwise I had quite a big gap in my CV at this point of a number of years, which would be quite hard to explain. I'm sure there are ways around it, but I felt like I wanted to do something about that big gap. And secondly, because I genuinely loved my work, I really believed in it. I put countless hours into it. I'd done archival research that I really wanted to share, and I wanted to get my doctorate and have my work out there in the world in some way, even if it was a downloadable PhD, whatever it was. I kind of wanted to have that tangible thing at the end of it. And of course, like being called doctor and all that, it's all fun. So I decided to go back. But as I was embarking on that last stage of my PhD thesis, I was also actively looking for work. And I have to be honest here, this was a really difficult stage. I knew that I wanted to work in either the third sector or the arts and cultural sector, or some combination of both, which would draw upon the PhD work and also that previous career that I already described. But at this point, my CV looked pretty strange, like nothing followed a conventional linear route. It didn't make much sense to like a passerby who wouldn't really get who I was and what I'd been doing. And also I wanted to work at a pace that felt comfortable to me after what I'd been through, rather than kind of being freshly overwhelmed with a high pressure senior role, for example. So all this meant that I was going to start somewhere in an entry level position. where I thought I could then build up my skills, get to know a new workplace, and identify some routes for progression. So I was really committed to that. That was the course I was going to take. The next challenge for me was looking at my CV and working out how to present it based on kind of what I'd been through and the fact that I was transitioning out of academia to a non-academic role. And as you all know, the conventional CV is a chronological account of your work, your education, and your training. And those three areas are often grouped separately. And I think if you're a PhD student, you can probably identify with this, that, you know, those things overlap much more than they would for someone who's kind of maybe completed university and then gone on a career route. When you're a PhD student, your PhD is kind of the most momentous thing you've done, probably. So it feels really weird for that to be listed at the bottom of your CV alongside, you know, your undergrad or your A levels. So that should be kind of front and center in a lot of ways. But how do you do that when you're not applying for an academic role? Everyone's opinion may be different here, and you may disagree with me, but I felt far more comfortable replacing the kind of chronological model of a CV with one that took a more skills-based approach. So instead of a conventional timeline, I put headings like project management, research, presenting, and I could group together under these headings different experiences and jobs with the dates attached. So if my career could be described as squiggly, then for me, it made no sense to try and straighten that out in terms of a linear timeline. And that was the approach I took, and it worked. It worked for me in terms of getting, you know, going alongside a job application and handing those out. But when you've had this kind of squiggly career, it can be quite a challenge to draw upon those disparate experiences in order to respond to interview questions. So I can't count the number of times I froze in an interview setting during those early days of getting back out there, because I was totally unable to think of ways to describe, you know, for example, an example of project management or liaising with stakeholders or having difficult conversations. And what I would really advise now, and what I would do differently if I were to go back, would be to use that skills-based approach that I took in my CV to develop some kind of pre-prepared interview responses. So, you know, for an example of a time when you've managed an ambitious project, you know, you might think of everything that went into the writing of your PhD. You might think of a time where you organized a conference or you edited an essay collection, for example. So it was kind of reframing that. And I think all this comes back to what I was saying at the beginning about how when you're in academia, you really do have that sense of self that's bound up with being, you know, an academic, a PhD student, and it can be really hard to apply that very fixed identity to a non-academic role. So another thing I found useful was to try and rethink who I was. You know, I wasn't a PhD student or a PhD holder or an aspiring academic. What if instead I was a researcher or a writer or a project manager or a bit of a public speaker? And this really helped me to be more flexible in my thinking and to communicate in interviews and on application forms. And it meant that I could see myself going for a wider range of jobs and look at how I could develop my skills in new areas and connect the dots in different ways. So it allowed me basically to feel like I could contribute to other fields of work. So it was almost like a bit of a mind trick, but one that I would really recommend, just like a confidence trick, really. But again, I have to be honest, despite reframing my experience in this way, not all employers could see the value in a PhD. And I definitely had experiences going for jobs that I really wanted at organizations that I really respected, of being sitting across from people who would just kind of be scratching their heads at why I'd spent all those years writing a thesis. And what I was doing in the stage, I was just completing application forms kind of cold and sending them in. What I would do differently now is actually get in touch with prospective employers before submitting the application, just for an informal chat. I'd just describe myself, the work I'd done, ask them more about the role, and just kind of see if there was like a spark of enthusiasm and connection, not just from them, but from me, because an interview is always a two-way thing. I'm now regularly involved in the recruitment process where I work, and I really value when a candidate emails or calls about a job. We all express ourselves differently, and an application form, especially one with like a concise word count, for example, it can't always capture who we are and what we've done. But eventually I found Arts Council England, where I work now, and their values really aligned with my own, particularly around public engagement in arts and culture. But not only that, they really recognised the worth and the relevance of the PhD. And I remember going for my first interview. It was a very rainy Friday morning. It was the day after my Viva. And the first thing they did was ask me about how it went. I passed. They were really pleased. They were saying congratulations. They asked me about the focus of my studies. And I immediately felt that I could work with them and I would find that work fulfilling. So, you know, there are places out there that really value that work. And I think it's important for you as the candidate to kind of get a sense of that as well, and where you see yourself. But the transition to non-academic work did take some getting used to. I don't think I'm alone in saying that academia can breed some extremely unhealthy work patterns. I've already mentioned overwork, but a related problem is that work in academia is often very solitary, which means that work can easily expand to fill the time. And if you're working from home, your whole world can revolve around your job or your studies. But office work, back when this was the norm, pre-pandemic, was a real eye-opener for me after so many years out of it. For the first time in years, I was working alongside other people during set office hours. I was having to get used to working in a way that could be interrupted at any point. And where that sense of perfectionism that academia really breeds had to be left at the door. If, for example, you wanted to make your train home and, you know, just leave the office in time, you have to just say this is good enough and move on. Once we went into lockdown and began working remotely, those patterns really started to creep back for me. And I had to be really conscious not to slip back into that all-consuming academic way of working. I want to close by saying that the best bit of the transition to non-academic work for me has been that mix of work and life. I have hobbies now. I read for pleasure rather than worrying about what, that I should be prioritizing a different book as something more related to my research, for example. I don't work on weekends. I don't often work on evenings. I sleep better, and I'm fortunate that I work in a setting that still allows me to engage in the things that I find interesting. It definitely took a while to get to this point, and I do have some regrets that I worked in a setting that was so inflexible, ableist, and resistant to change. But it did allow me to reevaluate what mattered to me and carve out a life that wasn't bound inextricably to work. So finally, shortly after leaving academia, I was offered a contract to publish my thesis as a book. And I really ummed and ahed about this for a while, like why go back to that way of thinking, that way of working. But I ultimately decided to adapt the PhD in my own time, on my own terms, and without the pressure of what jobs the publication might lead to. It was just for me, and it allowed me to reconnect with the enthusiasm that I had back when I first decided to apply for my PhD. I've got the book here just for a quick plug, because when else can you show off the book? And I mention this because having a life outside academia doesn't mean that you're not still engaged in writing, research, and publishing. In many ways, I feel more engaged. I feel less tired, certainly, less fraught with anxiety. And I'm now keen to write for more non-academic audiences in what form that takes. But I also like cooking and gardening and being lazy, and perhaps those things should also be on my bio alongside writer and researcher. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for sharing your perspective and your viewpoint on and that journey, and especially the sort of personal and very honest aspects of that. I think we all appreciate, one of the things we all appreciate about ECR Day is how frank everyone is, and that's what makes it so informative. So thank you for that. And our final speaker for today is Lucy. So Dr. Lucy Whitmore. Lucy is the curator of fashion at the Museum of London, where she works both on the dress and textile collection and as a content lead on the new museum galleries. And in 2019, she completed her AHRC-funded PhD at the University of Glasgow, and her thesis was entitled Fashion Narratives of the First World War. Lucy explored the PhD explored the impact of the war on women's fashion in Britain, and Lucy has published on the subjects of morning dress and remnant fashions, and she's currently working on a project researching London's Jewish fashion makers. Thanks, Lucy.
So yeah, thank you so much for inviting me to take part today, and thank you so much to Tara and James for their really interesting talks as well. I found it really fascinating to hear about other people's career experiences, and there's a lot of overlap as well. And I really related to some of what they were saying about making the most of those things you can do alongside your PhD. That's really important, and also just making sure that whatever you do afterwards is working for you and suiting your lifestyle. That's such an important part of any work setting. So yeah, thank you. So I'll start with a disclaimer, which is that I never wanted an academic career. That was never my plan. It was never an option for me. So I'm coming at this from maybe a slightly different angle, but I, for the first sort of 24 years of my life, wanted to work in art or design. I come from a creative background, and about 10 years ago, switched for various reasons, which I'll go into wanting to work in a museum. So that's very much kind of what my career plans and trajectory have been. And while I was trying to work out sort of how to talk this through, I found some of my old CVs, and so I've dug out a couple of those, which is a little bit cringy, but I'm going to share them with you as a way to kind of show how my career has worked over the last 10 years. So this is my CV from early 2012. This I used to apply for a freelance design job in New York. And at this point, 10 years ago, my career had been totally focused on being a designer. I had a diploma in art foundation studies and a BA in textile design. I'd done various design and creative internships, and I just finished working at a fashion startup. So it was a very kind of different career plan than I had in mind. And as you can see, this is the second part of the CV. It looks very different from anything that you would apply for an academic or museum job with. But later that year, I started working as a research assistant on a project centered around a collection of historic embroidery. And that was really the turning point for me in my career. Through that project, I met so many people and I learned so much about museums and archives and collections. One of the things I did whilst working on that project was utilize those connections that I'd made. And I asked 3 people, a curator, an archivist, and a conservator, if I could come and visit them at work and either shadow them for half a day or just talk to them about what it actually is they did. Because at that point, I really didn't know the difference between those 3 roles. And I wanted to, I knew I wanted to work with collections. I just didn't know what the difference was. And I really, really recommend doing that if you know people who work in kind of different museums, collections, archive type roles. If that's what you're interested in, find out what they actually do every day, because a lot of it surprised me at the time, and it really helped me kind of shape my goals going forwards. So the following year in 2013, I enrolled on the Dress and Textile History Master's Programme at the University of Glasgow, which included a museum work placement. And that was really the start of me building towards a museum career. I hope to get a job at the end of that. And at the end of my Master's, I applied for, I think, about 3 entry-level museum jobs in Scotland. This was the CV that I had at that point, and I didn't get any bites. I didn't even get a reply to any of my applications. So I was a little bit demoralized by that at the time. I now know that I didn't have enough hands-on experience, but at the time that was tough. So the CV I had built on my heritage and history and collections experience, but it still wasn't enough. But luckily during my Master's, as a slightly sort of panicky backup plan, because some other people in my program were applying for PhD funding and that sort of sounded like something I should be doing, I did apply for PhD funding. And over the summer after I'd graduated, I found out that I'd been successful. And I was really uncertain about doing a PhD because I knew I wanted a museum job. But I spoke to a senior curator of a fashion museum, and she advised me that it was a really desirable thing in a candidate that they would have both collections experience and a PhD. So I decided to utilise this massive privilege of being offered PhD funding to do a PhD, to make it work for me, and to use the time that I had to do some museum volunteering. So I contacted various local museums, and luckily the Museum of Edinburgh wanted some help with their dress collection. So I agreed to start doing 1 day a week there as a volunteer alongside my PhD, with the support of my supervisors as well. So I spent almost 4 years there in total, some of it as a volunteer and later as a funded intern. And that was a scheme that was through the Scottish Graduate School for Arts and Humanities, who were the AHRC funding body that funded my PhD. And this really was the most important work experience I had before I got my current job. Because it was a small organisation, they let me do everything. So I got cataloguing, conservation, public engagement experience. I worked on a gallery project. I got to meet people at every level of the organisation. They were incredibly generous, and it was such an informative experience. I should say that during my PhD, I also took on a lot of other opportunities, sort of work experience, anything that came my way, really. I did funding applications to do things like running workshops and events and conferences. I did some freelance work in costume mounting, actually for a Muriel Spark exhibition. I got involved with professional networks in my field to make connections. So I really maximized that 3 to 4 years to try and get as much from it as I possibly could. And I should say as well that the subject of my PhD, which was women's fashion in the First World War, was very much focused on collections and museums as well. So one of the things that I did was visit a lot of other collections. And when I was doing that, I really would grill any curator of the collections that I went to see and try and learn from them and make connections with them as well. And that came to be really useful when I was applying for jobs later on. So in the final year of my PhD, I started applying for jobs. I should say I had about 3.5 years of funding. So for the final 6 months, I had a completely unrelated job that I did not enjoy, but it was, a necessity. But it helped me incentivize that applying for jobs, looking beyond the end of the PhD process. So this is a CV from the start of 2018, which is when I was sort of starting to finish writing up. I applied for, I think, 3 or 4 jobs seriously before I got the job that I have now. So the jobs I didn't get, one of them was an academic, it was a heritage project at a university. It was outside of my field. I really don't know what I was thinking that I would get it, but I applied anyway. It's always good practice. I applied for a project that I thought I was a shoo-in for. It was a textile history and public outreach project at my university. I knew people involved in the project. It was very much something I felt super qualified to do. I had an interview and then I didn't get it. I was the second choice and I was really, really disappointed. And yeah, it's always tough to move on from that, but it's out of your control. And then I applied for essentially the same job that I have now, but at a smaller museum in Scotland. And I didn't even get a response to my application. And I think that's one that I really learned a lot from, because it was the exact same application, the exact same CV that got me the job I have now. And it's something that I've kind of shared when other people have asked me for advice about applying to museums, is that, the process is subjective. It can be a little bit random. It's really important not to take it personally or to beat yourself up, because the museum sector is incredibly competitive, and a perfect CV, and I'm not saying mine was perfect at all, but even a perfect CV just might not be the right fit in a certain organisation. And I'm so happy that I didn't get those jobs, because I feel that the job I have now is the perfect fit for me. And there was one other job that I didn't get. It was a project I had devised in collaboration with the National Library of Scotland. It was going to be funded by the funding body that funded my PhD. I had worked with them so much and they'd never said no to anything I'd applied for before. And again, I thought it was going to happen, and I got a rejection for that one the day after I submitted my PhD thesis, and I was absolutely heartbroken. It was such an emotional moment, handing in that thesis that you've built up to for so long. And the next day to get this rejection from the organisation that had funded my PhD, I was just heartbroken. And it's really tough. Like I said, there are so many kind of bumps in the road, even when you think that you found the thing that's perfect for you. So those were the jobs I didn't get. By the time I applied for the Museum of London job, which was in October 2018, I'd added a bit more to this CV. I'd submitted my thesis, I had a semester of teaching, and I'd also done some work on a research project. And this is the sort of third page of the CV, which shows some of the other types of stuff that would have been included in my application. So as well as academic qualifications and employment history, I had, public speaking, engagement projects, conference papers, my publications, involvement in societies, funding and awards. I'd been advised to literally put how much funding I had been given, and sort of other training and skills. So that kind of shows the sort of content that was going into my applications as well. I also found this, which I thought was quite interesting to share. This was a sort of prep sheet that I'd made for myself for the job interview. I had never thought that I would get this job. It came up and it was a dream job, but I was just like, well, I won't get it, but I'll apply because it's good practice. And then I got the interview, and the interview was 2 weeks before my PhD Viva. And I thought, well, I won't get it, but a job interview will be really good practice for my Viva. And I tackled it very much like a Viva, so I took it very seriously. And on this prep sheet, I've gone through the job application. I've kind of distilled what I think the key things they were looking for were, and alongside each of them, I've put my own experiences or talking points that I want to cover. I've also listed the questions that I wanted to ask them. And this is something that I believe is so important in any interview, but what I can speak to is museum interviews. I think the questions you ask are such an important part of an interview. It can really be an opportunity to show that you understand who they are, what they're about, what the museum does, what they care about, and also to show your enthusiasm. So that was another thing I thought it was really important to be prepared for. One other thing I'll mention about the museum interview process is the practical test. And I remember hearing all these rumours about this and thinking it sounded awful, that in a museum interview, you'll often be presented with an object and asked to talk about it. And I would just say for anyone who is concerned about that, not to worry about it, because it is not there to trip you up or to test you. It's just a really nice opportunity to show that you are comfortable with objects and with storytelling through objects and interpreting them and thinking about them. And even if you can't identify it, it's just showing that you know how to go about doing that, what you would do, where you would start. So that was something I was very scared of about moving into museums. So my job now, working at the Museum of London, I should start by saying that it absolutely is my dream job. I absolutely love what I get to do every day, and I feel that it is an absolutely perfect fit for me. So as fashion curator, I'm a subject specialist, so I do get to do some research, not very much at all, and what I do get to do, I often have to fight for, but it's there. But I'm also expected to be a generalist, and this was something that was challenging initially. I work across collections. We're currently building a new museum. This picture on the left is me standing on the top of the new museum building, which was very cool. And I'm working on galleries that cover sort of 2,000 years of history and all of these different kinds of collections. So that's been a really interesting challenge. I also do a lot of work on managing a collection. I do new collecting, I work on displays, do public events, I answer inquiries, I create content for our social media channels, I supervise a PhD student, I manage volunteers, and so much more. It's a very diverse job. So the big difference for me I realized after, coming from a PhD straight into this was being a PhD student or an academic means you need to know a huge amount about one small subject. So my PhD was on the First World War. I knew loads about 4 years of fashion history. My job now is to know a little bit about a lot of subjects, and I can't even tell you how varied it is. I mean, last week I was doing in-depth research on the history of toilets. So it just shows you how varied it can be. And I need to know basically how to find something out quickly, how to validate it, and how to interpret it for different audiences. So it's a big and a complicated workload. I'm constantly switching gears. Like James was saying, I'm often interrupted. I'm working with lots of other people around. I would say my job is not well paid. The museum sector generally isn't. But I am incredibly lucky to do something that I love. And it's so much better suited to me than academia ever would have been. One other challenge I would mention is the move. I had absolutely no intention of leaving Edinburgh. I'd been there for 11 years. It was my home. I did not want to move to London. But just like academia, sometimes in the museum sector, you do have to move for jobs if you are passionate about wanting a very specific type of museum job. Museum jobs don't come up very often. It was right for me, but it was incredibly hard for the first 6 months. I just started to get used to it, and then there was a pandemic. So it wasn't easy, but I know it was the right move for me. But I would just advise that, you want to kind of think carefully about moving into this sector because it does come with some of those same limitations as academia. So I'll finish with some tips on museum applications. So the first thing I would say is to do your research into the sector and never think of it as a second choice or a backup plan or an escape from academia. I've mentioned a few of the sort of downsides of the museum sector, but I also think it's so many people's first choice and so many people's passion that it will read on your CV or in your applications if you're seeing it as a backup plan. So I wouldn't go there if that's how you feel about it. I would say it's really important when you're applying for a museum job to research the organisational aims and objectives of the specific museum that you're applying to. They'll be somewhere on the website, and if you can fit those in somewhere to your application or your interview, you'll be ticking some of their boxes straight away. I would think creatively about the past experiences that you've had and how they relate to the museum sector. For example, you may not have had a collections-based job, but if you've done a material culture PhD or you have done archival research, then you will have worked with special collections, and that is relevant experience. If you know how to go into an archive, how to follow the rules, even somewhere like, a national library where they have, sort of library enforcements in place, all of that stuff relates to being around a collection. So just, dig a little bit deeper and think creatively about how you can show them that you understand collections-based work. And I would say one thing that's really, really important is understanding the nuances of different types of museums and collections jobs. That's what I was saying earlier on about talking to conservators, archivists, and curators. There are so many different types of collections jobs that you may not be aware of if you haven't spent a lot of time in the museum. For example, registrars or documentations work. People who work in the sector will already know this stuff. So if you're coming sort of slightly as an outsider, you just really want to make sure that you show that you understand. And I would say it's really important to do that at an institutional level as well. Curatorial jobs can be very different organisation to organisation. Some curators also do public engagement and education and outreach, and some just do exhibitions. I'm somewhere in the middle of those things. So it really depends on the size of the organisation. So just make sure you've kind of done your research there. Use your career service if you're a PhD student and that's available to you. Mine was super helpful at Glasgow. And one of the things they offered was practice interviews. So I had a full mock interview with the National Trust for Scotland. And I cannot tell you how much I learned from that process and how useful it was when I came to do interviews later on. If that's not offered to you, find someone else to do it for you. I'm sure most people would happily give up half an hour to help you out, and make it as formal as possible so that it feels real and that you can get really good feedback. Finally, make connections and use them. So if you are visiting collections or at a conference or at an event and you get to know somebody, those connections can be so useful. Not that they can give you a job, but they can be the people that do a practice interview or read your CV or share past job applications with you. I asked a lot of people for these kinds of things when I was applying, and people are so generous and so kind. And once they have helped you, I will now happily pass that on to other people as well. It's a lovely sort of chain of giving. So yeah, definitely make the most of those people that you meet along the way. And I think that is it from me for now.
Thanks so much, Lucy. That was, again, really insightful. I'm going to put everyone back into gallery mode as we move into the Q&A. I was just struck in your talk, especially then, with links to what James was saying about kind of performative overwork and a lack of balance. And I think it's really useful for us to hear that while that is a problem in academia, it's a problem in lots of sectors. And, you know, I followed a sort of non-traditional trajectory and had a career before the PhD, and, you know, it was a problem in that sector too. So I think it's really good for us to be honest about finding that balance in whatever we choose to do. But to sort of put a slightly more positive spin on it, I think the thing that I've taken from all the speakers today and the speakers in the previous panel was that the people who seem to have the most success are people that are pursuing things because they bring them joy, and not just to sort of tick boxes and fill lines on CVs. And I think that really came across in your talk as well. So thank you for that. So if everyone wants to rejoin us for our Q&A, the first question that we have is from Emily, who asks Tara about publishing. So quite a specific question to start off with. Emily's asking Tara, why might publishers not see academics as a great fit for an editorial role? Do you think that publishers see academics as suited to a specific area of publishing?
That's a really interesting question. Thank you so much for that. I think maybe, I suppose I can only really speak to my personal experience, and I don't know that, you know, it's necessarily true, excuse me, across the board to say that publishers don't see academics as a good fit for editorial roles. I can only really say in my experience that editorial roles were extremely competitive, and it helped to think about, you know, areas of publishing that maybe typically attract less applicants, I suppose. Often you'll speak to people and they'll be kind of dead set on getting into editorial, but I think it's really useful to consider alternate ways to be involved in an industry and in a career that you love, you know. With regards to that kind of coming into publishing, I think that specifically for editorial, you know, so many people will have work experience with publishers already. And for me, I was coming at it from a slightly different angle. I'd never kind of done the thing of doing a master's in publishing or gaining work experience with any of the big houses in London or anything like that. So in a way, I suppose that people with that kind of CV, you know, might potentially have a better time of trying to get into editorial. But for me, it was definitely, yeah, useful to think outside the editorial box a little bit with it. And so I don't know if that answers your question. But yeah, I think whatever you can do to expand your horizons is useful.
Thanks, Tara. And another publishing question before we move back to more broad themes. Tara is being asked again, how did you go about publishing? And I suppose James and maybe Lucy as well can speak to this. How do you go about publishing with newspapers? Do you send pictures to editors? Do you include samples of your work? How do you make those first approaches?
I think for me, so I started pitching newspapers in different publications, even maybe during my undergrad, I suppose, it was something that I was always really interested in. And before I went into academia, I thought that maybe I would, like to grow up and be a journalist one day. So I think that I started approaching editors fairly early, and it really varies from editor to editor. I think once you've built up a relationship, a shorthand develops. But I think in terms of initial approaches, it's really useful basically just to reach out with a pitch or even just an introduction of yourself and your interests, to basically give an outline of why you're the best person to write the piece you're suggesting. And if possible, writing samples are really helpful. So I think that initial approach is just about giving a sense of you, your interests, your slant, and why, there's a great fit between you and the subject matter where possible.
Does anyone else want to come in and add to that, or? No, that.
I was too busy listening to Tara's advice, taking it for myself.
Yeah, no, that's fine as well. And then I guess we'll pitch this question to James then in the first instance, but it might be relevant to everyone else too, because James, you were talking about the kind of wiggly, I'm not sure if that was the word you used, but wiggly career path and structuring your CV sort of in a maybe less traditional way. And so this person is asking, do you think it's okay to emphasize work experiences before a PhD if that is most relevant for the job, even if the experience was a few years ago?
Yeah, I do think that's okay, but it's something that I come up against a lot in my own, like when I continue to go for jobs, like where I currently work, the internal recruitment system, like you can list 3 previous jobs you've ever had, which is a strange thing, but I guess it's so you can cipher out what is the most relevant of your entire. So there are times when I list things from like 12 years ago next to something from that I'm doing currently, and I think actually more and more all of us are doing these kind of portfolio careers and bits and bobs, aren't we? I mean, it's like I think about what my parents did, which is like the same job from when they were 16 to when they retired. Like that doesn't really exist as much anymore. And certainly if you've been involved in academia, it's either thrown you into all kinds of new types of work, or it's been a bit of a disruptive thing that's been in the middle of what you've done before and after. So yeah, I wouldn't worry about that. But then I would also say, again, if you are a bit concerned and it's a job that you're not currently in, it's not a workplace you're currently in, maybe give them a call and give them an email and just explain what your skills look like, because it's not going to disadvantage you. It will only clarify whether this is the right place for you and the right approach you're taking.
If I could just add to that as well, I'd say, I absolutely agree with James, and I've worked on and off since I was 13, so I have so many different types of work experience, and I very much will cherry pick from them. It's a really handy, resource to have. And obviously you want to get through that first stage of application, which will be the written application, but at interview there are no limits on what you can talk about. So that's kind of why I did that prep sheet before my interview, just to remind myself of all the things I had that might be relevant. And even if they weren't fresh in my mind, because I hadn't been doing them in the last couple of years, they're still there. You've still done them. You've still learned from them. So drop in anything you want to in the interview, because if you've got to that point, they're definitely interested and they want to hear about everything you've done in the past that has kind of brought you to this point.
Thanks to all of you there. I completely agree. I think having, and that was said in the panel before as well, kind of having tailored CVs and cherry picking your experiences is really important. Eva is asking, for those of you who began your PhDs with academia as the end goal, but then moved into another career, is there anything you would have done differently with hindsight during the PhD itself? It can be hard to navigate the balance of working on the thesis with other academic activities, let alone accruing non-academic experience. So would you maybe have shifted your priorities with hindsight if you'd known you would pursue a non-academic career?
Should I come in? And yeah, I would have kind of looked more actively for types of maybe not even applying for things, but just having a look at what the landscape was like. Because when I finally kind of came to that realization that like academia wasn't for me, it's like, where do you begin to look? Like, I would do that, but I would also, I was talking about that thing like actively reframing how you see the work you're doing. I would kind of just keep more of a record of all that work that goes into a PhD. It's not just sitting in a room and writing 80,000 words. It's archive projects, it's conference organization, it's edited collections. And I would just kind of keep listing that and looking at where transferable skills lie. And the answer is there are tons of transferable skills. But again, like, my institution never encouraged us to look at it that way. It was all about this end goal of academia, definitely just keep a sense of flexibility in all the work you're doing, because I promise, like, so much of it is relevant outside.
Yeah, I'd agree, James, and I'd say that is one of the dangers of the way that some institutions structure the courses, especially maybe for students who've gone straight through from an undergrad straight into a master's, straight onto a PhD program, and haven't experienced other sectors. That flexibility is so important. Aoife is asking, what references do you recommend using when you apply for an academic job post-PhD? Sorry, I think a non-academic job post-PhD. Do you think it's okay to use your academic references? So if you're applying for something outside academia, can you use your academic references?
I can say what I did. So for my Museum of London job, I actually had to give 4 references because there wasn't one thing that covered a time period long enough for what they wanted. And they insisted on talking to all 4 of them, which took forever and was very stressful. But I did use my PhD supervisors. They had always known that I wanted this kind of career and were very supportive of it. So I felt very confident that they would give me the kind of recommendation that I wanted. I also used one of the people who sort of supervised my time at the Museum of Edinburgh. So that was a sort of volunteer/intern, and then 2 other work-related ones. But I've never actually asked either of my examiners for a reference because I've not applied for a job since my PhD viva. So I don't quite know how that would have worked. It might have been a little bit different.
Just to kind of follow on from Lucy there, for me, it was a little bit different. I ended up asking for references from people who I'd encountered through my role at the Tangerine Magazine, so people who I'd worked with in an editorial capacity, or, in terms of having established the magazine, who could really speak to that skill set. So I think that, as long as, whoever your reference is, I suppose the main thing is really that they can attest to, your enthusiasm for the role and your capability. And I suppose the main thing is maybe not thinking so much about the nature of, how they know you, but, that they know that you have the skills for the job. And I suppose that, whatever their name is or whatever their title, I suppose you really want to look for someone who can have that shining through in their reference, and who will really take the time to engage with, your profile, the work that you've already done, and who can really tailor the reference to that job as well.
I think this came up in one of the panels earlier today as well, about if you are asking a referee to do something that might be outside of the way that they would normally structure, if they're used to writing an academic reference, kind of having that conversation and giving them prompts and saying really what you've been doing and what you want out of that. If that is your only choice for a reference, explain to them that the role, send them the job criteria so that they're aware as well, and they can write you the best reference. So we just have a question for James here as well. Lauren says she thought it was really interesting what you said about how certain employers seem to appreciate why you do a PhD, but others won't necessarily appreciate that. And Lauren is wondering if sending initial email is a good way to gauge how an employer might feel about that.
I certainly think that getting in touch with a prospective employer is a good idea. I don't know about an email, because I often see on job adverts, if you're interested and want to discuss it in more detail, it's usually a phone number attached. And I think speaking on the phone for most of us is quite an anxiety-inducing experience. It is for me. But I think the good thing about it is it's a bit of a two-way thing, and you can pick up on their mood, and you can maybe you don't have to formally write an email where you describe, how your PhD has led you. Instead you can just say, I've been doing this for the last 3 years. I think it's really relevant, and but can I just check that these are the kind of skills you're interested in? I don't know, it just might help you to pick up on their enthusiasm or lack thereof, unfortunately, because an interview is always a two-way thing, and it's important that even if you get your foot in the door in terms of getting an interview, that you feel like this is a workspace that's going to maybe value those skills that you're bringing from the PhD. I don't know, like I said, there was an organization that I was so wanted to work for, who I won't name, but they just couldn't have been less. It was like, why would you do this? To the point where I was wondering why I'd got an interview. And then where I ended up working, their enthusiasm was really palpable, and I just felt like I really wanted them to tell me that I'd got that job. And then when I started there, like the amount of opportunities that they were directing me in because of my PhD and the skills picked up from that, it just felt like such a good fit. It felt like I was being really nurtured in terms of bringing those skills to the organization. So I think there are some kind of happy stories relating to that.
Thanks, James. I might use my privilege as chair to ask kind of a closing question, unless anyone else has a pressing question. But I'd like to sort of put you all on the spot a tiny bit and ask you to sum up one tip you would give for someone who is really worried about leaving the academic bubble and changing direction. And then, so one tip for that, and then one thing you love about the decision you've made to have a non-academic role. That is quite a putting on the spot, so no pressure if you can't think of anything.
I think I can go first. I'm going to think on my feet. So one thing I love, my absolute favorite thing about my job is working with people. I really didn't enjoy the loneliness of the PhD, even though I made tons of very good friends and spent a lot of time with other people, but essentially you're a one-man band, and that's not for me. The day that I worked at the museum, I called my human day because I got to see other people. So I love my colleagues. I love working in a museum that's open to the public and there are people, and the very, very, very best bits of my job are when I get to show someone else objects and talk to them directly. And I did that sort of through my PhD. It was just that at a remove. So I wrote about them and then somebody else read about them. And now I get to do that in person, and it just brings me so much joy. And I think for leaving the academic bubble, I would say you can still have a public presence as somebody who knows about stuff without being in academia. It's not on the same level in that, I'm not constantly publishing. I don't have time to do that. There's other kind of parts of academia that are just impossible if you have a full-time job elsewhere, but you still can build up a public persona. I get asked to do radio and to contribute to things. I get to put stuff out on social media through the museum. I get to write for the museum. I get my name against things. You can still build up that persona if that's what you want to do. It's just in a slightly different way. So if that's the kind of thing you care about, is being an expert in your field, that is still a possibility outside of academia.
Thanks, Lucy. That was really great. Anyone else want to contribute? Or?
Sure, I can jump in. I suppose in terms of something that I've really grown to love about publishing as opposed to academia is, as Lucy just said, that like collaborative element, the sense that it is really sort of all hands on deck, and also the pace of publishing, I think, has been a really nice change. So again, instead of looking at one subject in really great depth for a few years, this need to quickly get acquainted with a whole range of material. And I suppose publishing in particular, whether you're putting out 60 books a year or 200 books a year, you need to be kind of across a lot of different areas, have your, a sense of what's coming up for a range of different titles at different points in their lifespans. And yeah, I guess that's been a really exciting change, and something that I've enjoyed since moving away from academia. In terms of anxiety about moving away, I suppose the only thing that I would say is kind of, have confidence in what you've already achieved, in the skills you've learned. And I don't think, James, as you said, everyone has sort of these portfolio CVs. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to be a kind of either or thing. So, as long as you follow what you're really interested in, there are opportunities for you to do in-depth research, for you to do different kinds of non-academic careers, and you can make it work hopefully in a way that suits you. So I suppose, it doesn't necessarily have to be sort of a limitation or a loss to move away from academia. Maybe it just provides you with a greater range of options to fashion a career that works for you.
Yeah, I would echo what both Tara and Lucy said. I don't think I can offer much more. They've covered everything, but the only small thing I'd add is I would kind of say well done to them for interrogating that at this stage, and I'm wondering what else they could be doing, because I know of a lot of people who didn't really ask themselves that question. They just kind of carried on with the blinkers on, and then they found themselves in these short-term contracts, which for them personally weren't quite working, and then it was maybe they should have been looking earlier on. So I would just say you're doing well just to be kind of having those kind of inner dialogue about what else is out there, and have faith in all the skills you've picked up. Even just getting on the PhD requires so much, so well done to them, whoever they are.
Thank you. That's a really nice positive note for our final question. Hello, Alison. I suppose I'd just like to say a huge thank you to our final panelists, and another big thank you to Professor Ramona Ray and the QUB Postdoctoral Development Centre and the QUB Research Culture Seed Fund for their support, but an especially huge thank you in this final panel to Alison for putting this all together. I think Alison deserves us all to give her a little virtual round of applause. So thank you so much, Alison, for the event. And I'm sure Alison might want to come in and say about where things are on Twitter and things like that.
Well, I have been live tweeting, so there is a stream of resources and such things, although I need to live tweet your excellent answers, the three of you, to that last prompt from Susie. And for those of you who maybe didn't see all of the panels or missed bits, Queen's is going to be uploading them to the postdoctoral development website, and you'll get an email, I hope, when that happens, and I will tweet about it. I would also like to thank Lucy, Tara and James for their brilliant talks for us this evening. You're all so impressive. I'm not surprised you have multiple options available to you, but also I really appreciated your candor and your honesty, which is something that I was really keen to have, really keen to support with the ECR Day events, because academia is really quite a tough career choice. Not that other choices are not also tough, but the honesty is really appreciated from me, and I know from the attendees as well. And I would also like to thank Susie for sharing so expertly all day. It's a really long day and it's quite a lot of work doing all the fiddly wee bits on Zoom, and you did really well. So I guess that's it. So thanks again, Lucy, Tara and James, and we'll probably be doing this again next year, but I will probably torture other people by making them to come and talk to us. But thank you so much, and thanks to all our attendees, and hope that you'll have a lovely weekend planned. So thanks very much, everyone, and take care.
Thanks,
Thanks,
everyone.
Alison.
Everyone.
Bye.